Good morning. Welcome to Brave Indigenous Conversations, episode 5. And shortly, we're going to be joined by Michael Hutchinson, who will introduce himself. I just wanted to take a minute to share for any new listeners, and I don't have a standard script written yet. Maybe I should do one about why I'm doing this. But those of you that know me know that I really believe in people's right to speak their mind, of course, within social limits, and that's where a lot of debate is. But um, especially in Indian country, there's a lot of oppressed voices and voices that are marginalized, and people just aren't heard. I mean, we're practically invisible. Um, so first you need to be seen, and then once you're seen, then perhaps people can hear you, and then at that point, maybe look to see if there's any difference of opinion. Um, so I just want to explain where I am this morning. This is really exciting for me. I'm on the Nakana River, which flows into the Sloko. The Sloko and the Nakana meet each other and then join, and then farther down, the Inclin comes on and meets them. And then after the Inclin join with the Nakana and Sloko, it becomes the Taku River. And the Taku River flows out into the ocean. And just around Taku River, a few miles, is Juneau, Alaska. So I'm in Tlingit territory in the northeast part of what is also known as British Columbia in Canada. And Tlingit territory is Taku River Tlingit territory is within what is known as British Columbia, the Yukon in Canada, and parts of Southeast Alaska. So I'm just waiting for Michael to get on. I think he's having a bit of technical. There he is. I'm going to add him to the stream.
All right. Sorry about
Yay!
that.
Good
I
morning.
was using
You
the
did
same
it.
computer we used yesterday, and it didn't work. But anyway, good to see you and
That's
good to be
okay.
online with you.
That's okay, Michael. I'm not hearing you. Can you turn your volume up a bit, please? Maybe we'll
Yes.
do some testing here.
Okay.
Great. Yeah, I
Can you hear
can
me
hear
now?
you, but it's very low. Yeah,
Okay.
it's still very low.
Hello. Can you hear me
Yeah.
now?
Okay, that's
Oh,
way better. Okay,
give
great.
me a second here. Uh, how's that?
It's acceptable. It's not like
Okay.
loud, and you're also fuzzy. I'm not sure why you're kind of gray.
Well, let me turn away
Technology
from
is
the
great.
window there.
Technology is great when it works.
Yeah. All right.
Okay, so I'd like to start by inviting you to introduce yourself, because in our culture, as you know, we don't really, tell people who they are or anything like that. I'd like to hear how you would like to introduce yourself.
All right. Well, you know what? I am. You know what? I'm going to turn off this light. Give me a second.
Sure, no problem.
All right. I am a member of the Misipawistik Cree Nation. If you look at a map of Manitoba, there's the big lake that goes across from the Rockies, the North Saskatchewan River. And so that's where my First Nation was. And I also grew up, graduated high school from a Canadian town called Lac du Bonny, which is in southern Manitoba. And that's where I met your
Mm,
brother and became good
yeah.
friends with your brother. Um, yeah, my family, Grand Rapids was important to the fur trade, and so that intersection was um, uh, very important. So my family, moved goods up and down those falls for generations, I guess, in York boats and on their backs and that sort of stuff. And so yeah, I guess that's how I introduced myself. Currently, I'm working at the Manitoba First Nation Education Resource Center here in Manitoba, which is sort of a school board, um, sort of a teacher resource center, and also a publishing house.
Mm,
And I'm also the author of the Mighty Muskrat Mystery Series, which is a series
nice.
of young kids' books that are sort of like First Nation Hardy Boy books, I guess you'd call them.
First Nation what?
Hardy Boy books.
Hardy Boy books. Oh, cool. Oh
Yes.
my God.
Yeah.
I'm gonna have to read them.
Yeah. Well, there's 4 of them now. Each book. This is the first one, The Case of Windy Lake. Oops, there we
Oh,
go.
wow.
Yeah, and then
Okay.
this is the latest one. It's called The Case of the Rigged Race. So each book sort of has a mystery arc. In the case of Windy Lake, an archaeologist goes missing, but then each book also has a secondary story that has to do with a lot of times two poles of First Nation thinking. For example, in the first
Mm,
book, they have a cousin who chains herself to the pier to protest the environmental damage from the local mine, but they also meet a
mhm.
young First Nation gentleman who's a single dad who is working at the mine, and that's how he's trying to be a good person, is by working at the mine and yeah, trying to
Huh.
provide for his
Cool.
family.
Cool. So you mentioned when you were beginning your introduction that oh, it went right out of my head. My goodness. Oh, huh. You were talking about.
Well,
Oh, it'll come
we
back.
I did know your brother at Lactabani, and
Yeah.
we went to high school. I left home at a fairly early age, about 17, and just after my 17th birthday, and so I was graduating high school and working full time. And I was living in a house with about 3 or 4 other teenagers. Now, your brother Dennis, I believe your dad gave him the option of either you go to high school or you run one of our stores, and he chose to run the store
Yeah.
in Lactabani. And so,
Yeah.
your brother Dennis was a big help to us in that little house,
Mm.
those teenagers and stuff like that. And as a guy who was sort of our age and running the store down the street, he was a big help for us.
Big shot, eh? He's a hard worker. Very
He
hard
is a hard
worker, my
worker.
brother.
Yes, I would say that. Yeah, and
Yeah.
we tortured him sometimes. I was thinking the other day actually that there's this one time. Obviously alcohol was involved, but we were at our house, and our roommate's microwave broke. But we remembered Dennis had a microwave, and we wanted popcorn, so we went to Dennis's house and we knocked on all the doors and all the windows, and he's a pretty heavy sleeper. He wouldn't wake up. So,
Oh my God.
but he had left one of his windows open a crack. So we broke into his house, stole his microwave and popcorn, and took it back to our place. And the next day he woke up and made himself breakfast. And yeah, a different friend came over, and Dennis had just put down his plate where the microwave used to be. And the friend said, "Well, where's your microwave?" And Dennis goes, "What?" And he looked, and he had just put down a plate where his microwave. So he ended up calling the police, said he was broken into. And then we called him and said, "Hey, we got your microwave and your popcorn." And then he had to call back the police and say, "Sorry, it was all a misunderstanding." But yeah, shenanigans back in the days when we were young
Nice. Yeah.
and foolish.
So I invited you to join me, Michael, on this journey today because not only because of your relationship with my brother, which is fantastic, but also because I was saying to you when we talked yesterday, you're very interesting. I find you very interesting. Your
Okay,
career path, has been interesting. Can you share with us some of that? Like,
sure.
yeah, very interesting.
Well,
Yeah.
I started working at a young age. My grandparents had 14 kids, and I was originally. My mother was a single mom. We met my stepdad just before I went into kindergarten. He's a wonderful Canadian gentleman who's passed away now, but he was a great guy. And but I remember my mom being a single mom, and my grandparents had 14 kids. And so because of the racist nature of northern Manitoba, because of the fact they had 14 kids, they were assimilationist in many ways, in that you got yourself a job, you provided to the family by working and that sort of thing. And so yeah, I started working at an early age. The first thing I did, I think I was a fisherman's helper on Lake Winnipeg. Then I was a gas station island attendant. I worked I worked in a jewelry store, and it also rented out VHS tapes. So I rented out VHS tapes. I was a groundskeeper at the Whiteshell Nuclear Research Station's underground research laboratory.
What the hell?
Uh, I was a forest fire emergency fire TAC captain. And then I was the handyman at the local hotel. And that was all before I was 18. When I was 18, I became a bartender on my 18th birthday. Because I left home, I was working at the local hotel as a handyman. And then as soon as I turned 18, I became a bartender. I've also done other jobs, being a bartender in Lactabani. I got to know this movie crew that was coming through town. And then about 2 years later, when I moved to Winnipeg when I was about 21, um, I just happened to run into one of these ladies, and somebody had ripped me off about $1,000. My roommate did a midnight move, and I literally bumped into this lady coming out of a hotel, and it was that lady I'd known 2 years before, and she said, you know, somebody quit today. And so I got there. She said, come down to where we are. And I got a job working catering for rock concerts and movie shoots. So I've done dressing rooms for like the Rolling Stones, Pink Floyd, Metallica,
What?
you know, Tina
See?
Turner. Sad that I never really got to meet her, but I set up her dressing room
Yes,
once.
yes.
You know, and so I've done all these things. I've had beers with Russell Crowe. I've smuggled beer for Steve Miller. Yeah, so I've had a lot of good experiences in my early 20s as far as that
And
goes.
how did
I
you
was
end up
also,
in communication? How did you end
well,
up in communication?
so my dad hated TV. And so sometimes he would remove it for whole seasons. And so I read a lot. We were always out in the middle of nowhere. My dad was a bit of a survivalist kind of guy. He was always one of those guys who wanted to get off the grid. And so we read constantly. And then so as I grew up, you know, I always tell young kids, if you want to be a writer, read. And so my writing skills was developed. And then in grade 10, they wouldn't let me take math because I kept making the band teacher cry. I apologize to Miss Sinclair, but I was a terrible student, and because of my own issues. And so I kept making the band teacher cry. So they wouldn't let me take band in grade 10. So they put me in this course called Enriched Fundamentals, which was basically a pile of foolscap at the front of the room and the toughest teacher. And he said, just keep quiet, use the paper, just leave me alone. And so I started writing.
Wow.
And then people said, well, listen, you have a talent here. And I come from a family of 7 kids. So, you know, if somebody says, hey, you stand out in this particular way, when you come from a big family, you latch onto that like a life preserver, right? So I started writing, and that led me to being a reporter. You know, I worked at, you know, I worked at a magazine called Aboriginal Times, which was in the Globe and Mail. I wrote for a hippie newspaper out in Calgary called the Calgary Straight. That magazine that went into Globe and Mail was bi-monthly. It was called the Aboriginal Times. And so, you know, I worked my way up from reporter to managing editor. And then I got headhunted by the Indian Claims Commission. Okay. And by that time, it was being run by Phil Fontaine and Jim Prentice, I believe. And that's sort of where I learned the communication side of the desk as compared to the media side of the desk. And, you know, the Indian Claims Commission was an amazing experience because, you know, as you know, Joan, when you get involved with your First Nation issues, they're sort of local to start off with. You start off with local issues, and a lot of people never get beyond that. They may go to their provincial issues, but it's really hard to get a national perspective of what's going on all over the place, right? And so the Indian Claims Commission, what they did was they looked at specific claims. And so they created these books that were about this thick, that were basically lawyer written histories on the First Nations relationship with Canada, the decisions that led to the specific claim or their land claim or their treaty or whatever. And then the issues that came out of that, and then the lawyers proceeding. So my job was to take those great big thick books and boil them down into a little magazine that we put out every couple of months called Landmark Magazine. But anyway, it gave me a national perspective, right? And you got to let's look at the treaties. Like if you look at the Confederation and Friendship treaties, you know, out east, very different from the numbered treaties in the middle, and then also very different from the few treaties that were signed out in BC and the modern treaties that are being signed out in treaty now. So getting the understanding of the history of each one of those and how each relationship is different with Canada was a great gift for me. And so so the Indian Claims Commission was awesome. And then after the Indian Claims Commission,
interrupt you there,
go ahead.
Michael?
Yep.
Can I just interrupt you there? Let's give our listeners, because not everybody listening is going to know, you know, Indian Claims Commission. They're going to be like, well, what's that about? Maybe you could share, and I'll add if I feel the need to. Why was there a need for an Indian Claims Commission? Like, what was that about? What is that about? What are specific claims?
Yeah. So so specific claims, you know, if you go back shortly after treaty was made, Canada passed a law that basically prevented First Nations from addressing their concerns around treaty in Canadian courts. Now, back then, you know, political correctness still existed even back then. And so Canada was kind of tricky. They didn't make a law that said First Nations can't hire lawyers. what they did was make a law that said lawyers can't take money from First Nations in order to address specific claims. And so in a roundabout way, in effect, they prevented First Nations from hiring lawyers. Now, this law didn't come off the books until about 1951. And that was mostly due to First Nation leaders coming back from World War II and starting to lobby for change once they had gone to Europe and learned more about how Europeans treated themselves and that sort of stuff, and how European systems, right? And got a better handle on what, European/modern hierarchies look like, and legal systems and all that stuff. And so that happened after World War II. By 1951, we got that law taken off the books, and that began the erosion of the Indian Act system and the residential schools, and it also started the land claims process. And so land claims, a specific claim is something that comes after a treaty is signed or made. First Nations make treaties, Canadians sign treaties. So after a treaty is made, if there's issues with that treaty, that comes under the heading of a specific claim. And so what happened was between 1951 and say, 1970 and the 90s was that these land claims were coming up. They were being put into the court system, which, as you know, Joan, is very adversarial. It ends up costing, the First Nation and Canada and the taxpayers billions of dollars to get these land claims through court. So it made sense on both sides to come up with some sort of venue in which these things can be negotiated and in which they can be settled before they get to the courts. And so ultimately, that's what the Indian Claims Commission was set up to be, was sort of this body
I wonder, do you know if there's been much success in the resolution of the specific claims through that process? I don't know. I'm just wondering if you know.
Yes, well, it depends. So what would happen would be First Nations would go into the specific claim process, and then there would be negotiations. If negotiations broke down, then it would go to the courts, right? And so there was always that secondary source of restitution, so to speak. There were some claims, a lot of claims, I believe, that were resolved, smaller ones and larger ones. I think of the Qu'Appelle Valley settlement claim was one of the biggest at the time. And so that body ended and died, and there is a new claims organization, and I'm not really involved with that one, and it has a cap on it, on the claims that it can settle. So there are some people I'm not certain people like the new one as much as they like the old one.
Yeah. A couple of things I just wanted to add, that the specific claims process, as I understood it, like you described it in the context of treaties, and the specific claims process was also open to First Nations in British Columbia, for example, that didn't have treaties, but when the reserves were created, there was something wrong, like something not done properly. I mean, not that the reserves are proper in the first place. Oh my God, Joan Jack said they're proper. No, but so there were opportunity for First Nations where there was no treaty to also file specific claims. I don't know. I know my husband's First Nation filed a specific claim. I don't even know where it is, or if it got resolved, or what, because my experience in those processes is they tend to bog down in lawyers, and Canada basically comes to those tables with their position fixed and firm, and it's not a negotiation. It's still the same old treaty process. Sign here, this is the deal, and I'm glad that there's been some resolution that you're aware of. But my experience as a negotiator was that they're not negotiations. They're more like wear us down, to finally agreeing.
Well, I would, there was mediation. There's some great mediators, Ralph Brandt, who worked through certain things. I do agree with you in some sense in that there were, so for example, when a land claim, for example, happens, Canada would figure out through loss of use, they would go year by year. Let's say this is a field that could sell wheat. They would figure out the price of wheat every year and figure out, and then that number would then form the top of the negotiations. They wouldn't go above
Yeah.
that. It would only go below that, and so
Yeah.
I
And the
agree with you that there
problem
is a
the the problem is that the method of calculating the loss is from the European economic paradigm. It's not from our paradigm. Like, I want to talk about what is the impact of not being able to access my land on my culture, on my identity, on me as an Indigenous
Mhm.
person. Basically, like being in jail, and trapped in this spot, but my mind is going to broader things. I was even thinking of the laws around the prohibition of hunting, like how has that impacted? Like, I'm married to a hunter, and in living memory in his community, the game warden, would confiscate people's trucks and guns and stuff because our right to hunt for food, fish, and ceremonial purposes was not acknowledged at that point. Not until I think those cases came down in the early 90s even. And so
Yeah.
before that, we had to get a license just like everybody else. And there was no acknowledgement for our place in this country, in our own land, as the Indigenous peoples of these lands. So there's a lot of fear-based behavior in the hunters still today, like,
Yeah.
hurry up, we got to get, like that whole, like the game warden might be coming, and it's terrible. But yeah,
Yeah.
way digressed. So where did
Well,
you
no,
go after the other thing too? Wait, I just want to finish too.
yeah.
Your sound is quite like, I don't know if you're having a signal
Here,
problem. Like, you have good signal where you are? Like, do you have full bars? Or I know mine's booming in here, so I'm not sure if your internet connection is poor. I can't hear you at all now. Can't hear you at all now. Yeah. No, can't hear you. So this is the thing about technology. It's fantastic when it works, but I have an editor who will cut this out. Oh, now he's gone. Just stay with me. He'll be back. And the editor that I have will edit this out of the video that we end up publishing on YouTube and other places. Okay, I think he's coming back.
You hear me
Okay,
okay
I'm adding him.
about that?
I can, there you are. Okay.
Okay, can you hear me
Okay.
okay though?
Yeah, I can. It's just that once in a while you sound like a frog or something, but
Okay, I
that's okay.
apologize for that, but yeah,
Ah,
and
it is
my
what it
bars
is.
are all right. Okay,
Okay,
so you're
this is
asking
reality.
about
Yeah, so after the Indian Claims, where did you want to say anything more about the Indian Claims Commission before you move
no,
on?
no, no. It was an honor to work there. It was a great to work at the with Phil Fontaine and Jim Prentice. Yeah, no, I was very excited for the knowledge that I worked there. From there, I
Great.
was actually headhunted again, and I went to the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs. I started out as a writer there, but eventually became their director of communications or communicate. I can't remember the title, manager of communications, something like that. And so, yeah, that was also another great experience working at the Assembly of
What made it
Manitoba
great,
Chiefs.
Michael? Come on, give us some of the stuff. What made it great?
Well,
Very few people say working at the AFN is great.
I worked under, Dennis Whitebird, who was a great Grand Chief. I think one of the last, he's one of the Grand Chiefs who got a lot accomplished. Certainly I'd say over the last few. And so, I also worked for Ron Evans as well for a little bit under his Grand Chieftainship. And there were things going on. Manitoba was at the front of a lot of things back then. And
Yeah.
for example, we had the Framework Agreement Initiative, which ended up
Yeah.
dying, but in my humble opinion, was a very real attempt at creating a system of First Nation governance, right? Like, I tell this over and over again to people. If you look at Canadians, they can elect their mayor, they can elect their member of parliament, and they can or their member of the legislative assembly and their member of parliament. And all these people have to listen to the voter to keep their job. Now you look at the Indian Act system, and they vote for their mayor, which is basically their chief. Then the next person is the appointed regional director of ISK or, whatever is delivering services. And then the next person is the appointed Minister of Indian Affairs, who are de facto, and these two people don't have to listen to the people they govern. to keep their jobs. And that's why the Indian Act system takes so long. So the FAI was an attempt to try to bring democracy to these other two levels. It ended up dying, because politics is what it is. First Nation politics is what it is.
I actually had an involvement with the what the hell was it called again? A framework agreement, anyway, whatever. Because I was articling with Jack London at Buckwald, Asper, Gallagher, and Hentliff at the time, and so I reviewed and created documents informing that process through, and I don't know what Jack London did with them because he was my principal, but I was an articling lawyer at that time, and I'm quite familiar with all of the stuff that went on there. But yeah, it died. I don't know. It was a big dream, to have self-government for our people in Manitoba, but it didn't go anywhere. Yeah.
Well, it did. It gathered steam for a long time. But what happens in politics is that, a project, especially these long-term projects, are started by somebody who staked their political career on starting it. And then as it progresses along, people keep needing to stake their political career on keeping it alive. And so as you get further from that initial place, the politicians get less committed to that project, get less willing to spend their political cachet on keeping that project alive. And eventually, there's always this boogeyman. There's always this boogeyman that they're going to turn us into a municipality. It is a very real boogeyman, but at the same time too, there is so much that would have to be done in order for that to happen. And we all know it's easier to create a new system than to fix up an old one. So,
and then there are issues that, around any of these processes that aren't addressed by the fact that, what a Northern First Nation would need to prosper, and what, a First Nation adjacent to an urban center would need to prosper. And so those scenarios, my opinion and experience is that those processes do very poorly in addressing that reality. It's sort of the urban model, one fits all, and you should have a municipality in the middle of the bush wherever you are. Well, that's not going to happen. Yeah.
Well, yeah, and
So
that's the nature of First Nation politics. We had talked about the Indian Claims Commission and learning about the differences across the country. Like, my elders teach you are the land you live on. And so what you just described there, how rural communities are different from southern communities, that goes very down to the land that they live on and the intersections that are there, the resources available, blah, blah, blah. And it's different in the north and the south. And so that's what the FAI was about.
And from the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs, where did you go?
From the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs, I went to, I started up my own company, called Sparrowhawks Communications, and I worked that for a while. But then I eventually went to APTN. I was asked to join APTN Investigates, and I wasn't really a TV guy. My writing, I'm a writer, but the chance to write mini documentaries on issues that I cared about was something that really, attracted me. So yeah, I moved back from the communication side of the desk over to the journalism side of the desk again for APTN. Eventually, I got to host the news. I was the host of APTN News for about 7 years. And then I moved on, just trying different things. I moved back to the communication side of the desk. My first attempt at moving back to the communication side desk didn't go so well, but I did eventually get on at the AFN, and so I was contracted to be a writer there under Don Kelly, who's a great guy. Don Kelly of Fish Out of Water and Crazy Like a Lynx. Yeah, he's a great guy, and so he was my boss for a long time. I worked for him in communications, and then eventually Perry was reelected. I actually helped Sheila North on her campaign, but when Perry was elected, he asked me if I wanted to come back to the AFN and be his press secretary. And so yeah, I went back.
What was that like? What was that like being the National Chiefs press secretary?
Well, it's a very high profile position. It's an awesome job, and Perry, I think, was as far as First Nation politicians goes, very adept at the job of advocacy. The funny thing is Canada doesn't like the AFN and organizations like the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs or the MKO to call themselves lobby groups. They want them to call themselves advocacy organizations. Now, the reason why they don't want them to call them lobby groups is because Canadians don't have to lobby their governance system. Their their governance system is supposed to react to their wants and needs, right? They don't have to lobby it, right? First Nations have to lobby our governance system because of the fact that, like I said, these top two levels don't have to listen to us to keep their job. So we have to try to get our ideas in there. And that's the job of the AFN and the AMC. And this goes back to the FAI too. The AMC is not a government. It is a chiefs organization that advocates for First Nations. So is it the proper venue to create an FAI? To create a system that is supported by the First Nations people. And the crazy thing about making these systems is ultimately to make them work properly. You don't work with the people that you agree with. You work with the people you're fighting with, right? That's what these are about. They're decision making, dispute resolution. That's what governance is. That's what government is about. That's what our elder councils were about. That's what our head men talking to each other were about. It was all about dispute resolution, figuring out where we're going, and governance. And so if you want to reinvigorate Indian law, it's not about sitting down with the people you agree with, although that's very important. It's also sitting around with the people you don't agree with, and that's almost the most important part.
But my experience with doing that at the in representing First Nation governments is that the other party is not actually interested in changing at all.
Okay, so are you talking about Canada when you say that? Because I'm not.
Yeah,
I'm talking about the other Indians that you're hanging out with.
Oh, okay. You mean like intertribal?
When I'm talking about creating Indigenous law, only Cree can create Cree law. Only
for sure.
Anishinaabe can create Anishinaabe law. So when I say you got to sit down with the Cree you don't get along with to make Cree law.
Okay. I must have misheard you because
no, that's all right, because you're right. When it comes to Canada,
I totally get it. Like right
Canada
now,
wants to erode our law.
Yeah, so for sure. But the thing with that, for example, I'm involved in a revitalization of Tlingit Law project in my husband's territory here as a volunteer. And my husband and I are getting to be elders now. So Brian for sure is an elder. He's 69 and I'm 62. So we get invited places and asked to participate as elders. And what I've continually said from the beginning is that, we need to ask the right questions when we're reviving our own laws. Because if you just do this for the convenience of English or the convenience of the common law, then we're just going to be duplicating
election cycle.
Yeah. Then we're just going to be duplicating, same, my dad would say, same shit, different pile scruff, like it's, we don't want that. We have to ask people, and then language, that's where, you're at MF NERC now. Language is critical to the revitalization of everything, but I wanted to make one other comment about how we organize it. Just a memory came in my mind. Up in the Yukon, I wish I remembered the elder who said this, but the person, I don't even remember if it was a man or a woman, but they said how we should be organizing ourselves is according to the land, the watershed. Where the watershed goes, everyone who's affected by that watershed should be working together for the protection of that watershed, because the watershed is what protects us, maintains our lifestyle. And I've often thought that was such a, and then of course there would be, maybe different tribal affiliations in different parts of that watershed, but focusing on having the land guide and control our relationships for the good of the land, because what's good for the land is good for us, so I just threw that out there because it was a memory that popped into this conversation.
Yeah.
So
well,
you were going to talk.
What you just said there. Yeah. What you just said there inspired a couple of things. I'm not certain if you're aware of what Val Napoleon is doing out at the U of Vic, but she has started this. She's a great lady, Professor Napoleon, at the University of Victoria. she has started this a system where she's helping First Nations revitalize their law. And what she does is she goes back and takes their legends and their sacred stories, and she talks up, she pulls out the values and the decision making that was in those legends, and then she says, okay, so these are metaphors and these are, you know, ideas that our people were trying to convey in the past of how things should be done through these sacred stories and legends.
Mhm.
So by boiling them down to their values and beliefs and decision making, she can then say, okay, can we use these almost like legal precedent to make new
Mhm.
law, to discuss, okay,
Yeah,
if these are the base values, then let's apply
yeah.
these base values to the modern context. And that, you know,
And
ultimately colonialism was really Canada stopping our legal processes from evolving. Right. In my humble opinion,
absolutely.
as soon as a truck came onto our lands, the elders would be saying, okay, we got to make law around this. And certainly once somebody was hit by a truck, then the elders would say,
Yeah,
okay, we have to make rules around how people drive their
yeah,
trucks in our lands.
yeah,
And the fact that, you know, and that's what our legal system should have done, but it didn't because
yeah,
of colonialism. The second thing that you mentioned was about the watersheds, and that was part of the FAI too, was how are we going to organize ourselves? You know, do we want to make our, you know, I'm just using the word, don't get upset, our provincial governments, do we want to make our provincial governments based on, you know, our land, the watershed? Do we want to base them on our treaty areas? You know, do we want to base
mhm,
them on, you know, north and south? And so this would mean that maybe Anishinaabe and Cree people would be in the same province. I'm just using that as an umbrella word. And you know, but that was what the FAI was about, was how are we going to organize to make that second
yeah,
level?
yeah. I just like that, you know, because I live a very land-based life with my husband, you know, I that really resonated with me that like
Hmm.
now we're down here on the Nakana and you know the
Oh, I lost you, Joan. You froze.
oh, I'm back. Geez. Can you hear
Okay,
me?
there we go. Yeah, you
Oh,
froze there for a bit,
we
but you're
yeah,
back.
we completely well, I'm using Starlink and we've never had any trouble with Starlink, but maybe all this is my on my end. I don't know. I'm using the generator too for power, so
Okay.
maybe the power source is not as because next week I'll try to use the solar power. Maybe it'll be
Okay.
less wiggly.
That could be it. That could be it. All right. Well, Joan has zoomed out again, so I'm not certain if I'm still on, but I am going to babble. Take that opportunity. Yeah. So the FAI, you know, was this. You know, it was this plan. The Manitoba First Nations were okay. There you're back. I was gonna start. I was
I
just gonna
love
keep
it.
babbling.
I love it. When I came back, you know, the internet, it is my internet. And when I
Okay.
came back on you, I thought, look at Michael go. He just did like I, you know, he just carrying the ball right on Michael.
Well, you know, I have been the host of TV shows before, so you know, the show must go on.
That's great. Okay. So go ahead then. I love it.
Oh, okay, yeah, and so you know the FAI, you know, was an attempt by Manitoba First Nations to make this sort of second level of governance that was based, that would have been, you know, the grassroots people supporting it
Yeah.
and voting, so that they wouldn't be just voting for their chief, they'd also be voting for sort of a regional head man. And
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
you had mentioned, you know, like it does make sense. You are the land you live on. So it does make sense that
Yeah.
some First Nations in the similar landscape would come together and say, we have similar
Yeah.
values. Let's start making similar laws.
Hey, let's talk a little bit about and you know, you and I have known each other a long time, just passing, you know, and this
Yeah.
is so interesting because you have a lot of experience and thoughts on all this stuff. So one of the bees in my bonnet these days is that representative democracy does not work in Indian country. It does not work because we want more than the simply the ability to vote our leader in and then they're accountable in the normal ways through representative democracy like yeah, if you don't do a good job, you won't get reelected. You petition, you write letters, maybe you protest. Those are all the functions of representative democracy. And then once people are elected, then there's ideas around executive power and all this stuff that based on the platform of the person who won the election, they have the scope of authority to go and make these decisions without the people they represent, because theoretically they were voted in and they can do that. None of that flies in Indian country on the ground, grassroots, none of that. There's like the perpetual bitchy band member syndrome. And so, but what happens with that is the bitchy band member gets blamed, and throwing in some new fancy words these days: gaslit, lateral violence, labeled, put on blacklists. All of that is the response to the people resisting the wrong democratic system. And so what I talk about is something I just made. It might even be a thing. I don't know. I just make things up when I need them. And
Yep.
it's more akin to like participatory democracy. Like if you look at the clan systems of government that our ancestors had and some of our people still operate under, the clan systems of government do not delegate authority to their leaders. Leader power, the power of a leader, in my opinion, in Indigenous law, is delegated on a situational basis. As a situation arises, the people come together, decide what the best thing to do is, and tell their leader, okay, go do that. That's the complete opposite of representative democracy, where all of the power is transferred from the people to those elected, and then they just go do what they want. Then we're not happy, then we have another election. So I'm advocating all the time for the development of participatory democracy. So what do you think of what I'm saying?
I agree with, yes, we have a bunch of issues, in all that, starting right at the top all the way through. Ultimately, I agree with you that democracy was something different back in the old days than it is now. But, there has been a lot of change in our system, and I'm just going to talk about some of the cultural changes that have occurred before we even get to colonialism, even though some of these cultural changes have been inspired by colonialism and the way we live now. But the city, okay, the city environment, and I'd have to say, Joan, that in your description that you just made, you're talking about cultures like the Cree and the Anishinaabe, and maybe not so much the Longhouse cultures.
I don't know.
But anyway, because they had different systems, and the headman system that you're talking about, where somebody was appointed as a head, you're a commissioner, you're not the grand chief, right? And if I ever became grand chief, I would change the title to grand commissioner, because grand chief gives city people the wrong idea, right, about hierarchy. So, but we also have to think about the independence of people back in the old days, right? People picked their own medicine. They weren't waiting for bottles of pills from INAC, right? The chief didn't go out and pick your medicine. You did, right? When you hunted a moose, you took what you could, and then you gave everything else to the chief so he could redistribute. That's taxation, in my humble opinion. How many people are willing to give all their extra to the chief to give out to the community? Right? Oh, the chief used to provide for us all. Yes, but everybody used to give them 75% of their stuff, right? To be redistributed. So, as First Nation people, we're asking for a lot and not ponying up for our old systems. We want those chiefs should be following Indian law. Well, do you run to white man law as soon as it's read? As soon as the chief disagrees with you, as soon as the elders say this is the way you're acting, well, you say, but when it's a terrible issue, the issue of murdered and missing Indigenous women. But a lot of people say, we didn't have it back in the old days. Well, think of all the rules we had back in the old days not to make it possible. That guy buddy you have in college just wouldn't exist. You didn't talk to men that you weren't related to. You didn't even talk to a lot of the men you were related to unless you were married. And even then there were rules about who you can talk to, right? A Cree guy never talked to his mother-in-law.
Careful though not to blame. I know you're not meaning to blame the women,
no, totally.
Cultural,
no.
cultural rules protecting.
Exactly. Because it was the men that had to follow these rules.
For violence against women.
Totally.
No. Yeah.
Yes.
So I just thought I'd throw that in there for you. Yeah.
Yes. But there is, there is the idea of odds, right? And if there is arranged marriages, then the odds of there being date rape are very low, right? And date rape is a
Well,
guy.
I don't know, Michael. I think this is maybe a topic for another podcast, because in arranged marriages, if the woman is not happy with the marriage, then her man is raping her every time.
That's I would agree with that as well. But at the same time,
Yeah.
too, we also had divorce back in those days too, right?
Yeah, for sure. Lots of
Yeah,
divorce.
yeah.
Yeah.
And so,
Yeah.
that was part, people could divorce
Share the
their
blanket.
arranged person, right?
Share the blanket.
So,
Share
and
the
the
blanket.
woman,
Stay up close. Move on.
yeah, yeah. So, so there was all these rules. All I'm trying to say is that there are all these rules that existed that our people held that we don't hold today because we live modern lifestyles. And some of the
Yeah.
things that we say, that we long for from the past are gone, not because the chief isn't doing stuff, but because we are living modern lifestyles. Right? Does
Yeah.
that make sense? Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm not trying to blame
Well,
anybody,
to
but
a degree, for sure. No. I understand what you're saying. It's
yeah.
just that I'd like to see us move more towards uh, the, I suppose, elimination of the idea of executive power in those we elect. Like, there's got to be more requirement for the leaders that we put in place to account to us in between elections, because
Well,
we want to be involved.
yeah, and well, and the Chiefs are enacting the Indian Act system, which again,
Yeah,
is democracy light, right? Like if we
yeah,
had democracy at all these three levels, the chief is given a lot of responsibility because he is the only elected person. But back in the old days,
mhm,
like you said, there were different head men or women
yeah,
or groups,
yeah,
elders groups had different
yeah,
jurisdiction over different
yeah,
decision making back in the old
yeah,
days. Now all that decision making is put on the chief, and everybody's saying, well, why doesn't the chief take care of us? Well, the chief's got these two people on top of him,
yeah.
basically saying this is what you can and can't do. This is your parameters for existing. So yeah, I think ultimately it comes down to we have to reinvigorate our own law and stop using Canadian systems. And that means
Hmm.
working with each other and modernizing our law. A lot of people say, no, First Nation people don't, our laws are the old laws. Well, that is true. There is a level of sacredness to those laws, and that is our foundations. But like I said, if a truck hit somebody on our territory, our elders would have been making rules about trucks,
Yeah, for sure.
right?
No, I tell people that my iPhone, this is an Ojibwe iPhone because I'm holding it. So it does my spell check and spell correction and everything. I can teach it how to spell in my language, and I create my reality. I create my Indigenous reality, and because I'm living it is what I think.
Well, I,
Um,
I agree with you to a
so,
part. I think individuals can adapt, but I don't think that's an Anishinaabe cell phone until it is made in an Anishinaabe factory.
maybe, eh? Yeah, for
Yeah,
sure. But I still, I'm
and we
sovereign.
will get
Depend
there.
Disney. Depend this. I own myself, so I get to
Yes.
say what's mine. Yeah.
Yeah.
We
We can all
have
use
about
things in
10
that
minutes.
way, our way. Okay.
Yeah. We have about 10 minutes left, but I wanted to give you some time to, and this has been great. Like, obviously, we could talk for hours, but um, I want you to talk about your books, please. And
Okay.
I'm so going to buy them, and I want you to tell people how to get them.
Yeah, you can buy them at most bookstores. They're at, here in Winnipeg, they're at McNally Robinson. You can go to my publisher's
Okay.
website, which is Second Story Press, and order them off of
Second
there.
Story Press.
But they're in most bookstores. They're usually in the youth mystery or youth series section. They're aimed at kids from about 9 to 14. And yeah, so like I said, each book, this is the case of the missing auntie. This one deals with a great auntie who had been 60s scooped, and the mighty muskrats go
Oh,
try to find him. And the four muskrats, like they're like all First Nation kids, where groups of cousins are herded together, and then this group of cousins watches this group of cousins, and that sort of stuff. So yeah,
wow.
you got, let's say this is Otter. Otter's the most bushwise of the muskrats because his parents died in a car accident, so he was raised by grandma and grandpa, and so that's why he's the most bushwise and most familiar with ceremony. And then you have Chickadee. Chickadee is a strong Cree lady in the making, and so she's the sometimes boss of the group, and she certainly motivates the boys quite a bit. She's a strong Cree lady. Then you got a Tim. A Tim is sort of like the stomach of the group. He's the physical one. He's the tallest and the fastest and the biggest, but he's also always hungry. And then you got Sam, and Sam's sort of the book reader and the, and so each one of these sort of represents. Sam's the part of the leader. So him and Chickadee sort of face off as far as leaders, and then Otter sort of the quiet one who sort of represents the spirit, and then a Tim represents our physical side. And so, they live in a fictional Windy First Nation called the Windy Lake First Nation. It's in a fictional treaty area, and so while I don't really mention, where they're at, I guess you could say, a lot of people recognize, my communities in this, as well as Lac du Bonnet even, in this one, they go down to the city, which is what a lot of First Nations do. In the summertime, and they solve a mystery.
What are the four titles? What are the four titles?
Okay, so we got the Case of the Windy Lake. This one is about environmental protection. It's about a archaeologist who goes missing. Then the second one is the Case of the Missing Auntie. The muskrats go to the city, and the secondary story in this one is they have a cousin who's really doing well in the city, and then they have a cousin who was moved, or a friend from Windy Lake who moved to a poorer part of town, and he's basically being assimilated into a gang. So that's sort of the secondary story in this one.
Oh no, I'm frozen again.
In the case of the burgled bundle, a treaty bundle, memory bundle goes missing. And so the Mighty Muskrats have to find, and the Cree National Gathering has come to Windy Lake. So there's a whole bunch of people in town that they don't know. And then this bundle goes missing. And then the secondary story in this one, when the Cree National Gathering came to Grand Rapids, there was in 2007, I was a part of that. And what happened was, there was a conversation then about, there were certain ceremonies that were happening in teepees, and people were saying, well, why is this ceremony happening in teepee? Everybody should be watching it. But the elders who are holding the ceremony were saying, like, no, Canada might take away our ceremonies. Like, we're still trying to keep them hidden and sacred. And so there was this conversation, because there's a lot of Cree people who have lost so they're very hungry to see ceremony. But then there's people who have been strong in their ceremony who say, well, we still have to keep this strong. We still have to keep it hidden because Canada could take it away. So that's sort of the secondary story in the case of the burgled bundle. And then the most recent one, the one that just came out this fall, was the Case of the Rigged Race. And this is, the Trappers Festival comes to Windy Lake. So there's a Trappers Festival in town. Part of that is this dog sled race. And somebody's trying to mess with the dog sled race there's gamblers in town, and why are they trying to mess with the dog sled race? And this book, I guess the secondary story is a lot about how First Nation viewpoint on animals as compared to, say, European or city-based viewpoints on animals. And then I just finished writing the Case of the Pilfered Pin, which is not out yet. It's the fifth one. The Pilfered Pin. The pilfered means stolen, and a pin. It's about land claims, and there's Windy Lake has a land claim, and there's a surveyor pin that's gone missing, and so they have to find a surveyor pin. And so it's all about land claims. Teachers love these books because they're full of stuff that they can talk about their students about Canadian history, and they're all aimed at from 9th grade ages. I can
hardly wait to buy them and read them, and then buy them for my grandchildren.
Yeah, a lot of people are starting to really like them. The Case of the Missing Auntie, people say it makes them cry. But I've had a lot of adults say that they've learned a lot. And, I've had a lot of Canadians say that they really appreciate them. And that's one of the things I wrote them for.
I think the little girl inside me is my teenage girl. I read all the Nancy Drew. Every single one.
Yeah.
And the Hardy Boys. Like, I think that's how I survived living on an island or something. I don't know. Like,
reading was big.
I read, at camp here, we've raised all our children at the Nakana here, and they're all readers. Like, because now we have the internet and, devices and stuff like that. But once a child is, once it's ingrained in a child to be a reader, they're a reader, So, and so I think you just really excited the little girl in me, so that teenage Joan, 11-year-old Joan, is going to read all your books. And
Well,
then
I'd be
I'll buy
interested in
them
hearing
for
your
my
thoughts on them.
grandchildren.
Maybe we could
Yeah,
do another
I'll
show
buy them.
once you've read a couple, and you can let
Yeah,
me know what you
we
think.
could do that. We could do
Yeah.
that for sure.
Well, I kind of wrote them
So
because I got a lot of questions from Canadians and First Nation kids about the First Nation Canadian situation. So these books are an attempt to kind of address some of those questions and do some educating. Because I
nice.
think today's youth
Yeah,
are they've learned about the link between heart and mind in a way young people weren't taught in
yeah,
the past. So I think we have a
yeah.
special group of young people
So
today.
just to recap, if somebody's not in Winnipeg and they wanted to order them, they would Google Second Story Press and then
Second
type
Story
your name
Press.
in, I
Yep,
guess,
that's my
and then type
my
your name in. Okay,
yeah.
your
But if you go
publisher.
to McNally Robinson, I believe they're at Indigo as well. They're on Amazon. There's
Oh, okay.
also
So Indigo.
they're
Okay, go ahead.
also they're the first three are in audiobook format, and they're read by Ganatio Horn of Letterkenny fame, Winnie Corn Miller's little sister,
Wow.
and she does a great job. Dio is an awesome person, and with her acting skills, she really brings the story out. And so, if you're not
Okay.
into reading them,
Okay.
get the audiobook, put them on your truck, and listen to them as you're
Cool.
driving up north.
Awesome. Okay. So before I close, was there anything else you'd like to say before we close?
No, just to say, thank you for having me on, Joan, and thank you for all the work that you've done over the years, raising the profile on certain issues. Being a lawyer and attacking our issues that way, and then as well as through this way, by educating people and talking to people about the issue. So I really want to thank you for all that you've done over the years.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. So as you know, I love laughing and I'm super serious. Like I don't know, I will fight to the death, but I'm
Yes.
also ridiculously silly. And so in that vein, and not so much, but I have an addiction to earrings. I have an
Okay.
addiction to indigenous earrings, like bad. Like I probably have like,
I think you're
I
not
don't
alone in
know,
that.
easy 100 pair of earrings, and then I get addicted to a certain beater or artist for a while. It's like really out of control. So I
Yeah.
thought, oh well, okay, Brave Indigenous Communications with Joan Jack is going. Conversation with Joan Jack is going to be all about the earrings. So this morning I'm wearing these were made by Barb Fayant,
Okay.
Barbfayant, and she's out of Whitehorse, Yukon. She's an Anishinaabe
Wow.
and Métis woman, and yeah, and she gifted them to me. I was so shocked. I buy like
Yeah. Yeah.
98% of my earrings, but the odd time somebody will send me a gift. But yeah, I just love them, and they've got. I think she said this is
Cool.
fox, and then
Okay.
these are semi-precious stones here. So yeah,
Neat.
and
Well, you know
so when
what?
we were, go
When
ahead.
I used to work for at the Treaty Relations Commission, I used to ask elders, at lunchtime, I'd ask them questions just to get, funny responses. And so one of the
Yeah.
questions I would ask was, what is the oldest insult you know? What is the oldest insult that you know?
Okay.
And
Okay.
the oldest one that I've gotten was from an elder was, your sister wears dog poop earrings. Which, if you translate into that First Nation thinking, basically means your family's lazy, because you'd have all the, if your family was working, you'd have all the stuff to make earrings, right? So yeah,
Oh
the
my
elder said,
goodness.
he didn't say poop, but your sister wears
Yeah, yeah,
dog
yeah,
poop
yeah,
earrings.
yeah,
That's
yeah.
the oldest insult I've gotten from them.
That he could think of. That's funny.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
that could go
So
back,
thank.
that could go back all the way to the domestication of the dog, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So I apologize for the sound thing. I'm
Oh,
the podcast guy who helps me was saying to me, Joan, most people do these and record them and then edit them all out. And are you sure you want to do these live? And I'm like, yeah, because this
yeah,
is real. Like this is real life. And I don't want to be a part of anything that's perfect, because life's not perfect.
for
So
sure.
apologize to the listeners. This was our first time here from the Nakana call with Starlink satellite. And what I learned was I think using generator as a source of power might not be a good idea because there are surges. So
Yeah.
I think the surging in the power, but
Well, and
I'm
your
sure they'll,
computer, I guess, if it's not getting the full charge of energy, might cut down on its efficiency.
yeah, I don't know. Yeah. So I'm going to try the solar power next week. And next
Cool.
week, next week, it went out of my head who's coming. Oh, Claudette Chorney. She's guide outfitter in Alberta.
Excellent.
And so I said to her, you know, outfitting is a very controversial subject. And so would you be willing to come talk about your work as an Indigenous woman and an outfitter? And she said, yeah. So
Okay.
she's going to be here next week. And then after that, Chief Derek Nepanak will be joining us.
Cool.
So,
That's
yeah.
awesome.
So I just love this, Michael. I think I'm going to do this forever. I'm not going to run out of people to visit with. So
Yes, I don't think so. Well, and
thank
you're
you
great at it,
so
Joan.
much. Thank you
Okay,
so
have a good
much.
one.
No, go up, man.
Bye-bye.